So, if the title of the video hasn't made it abundantly clear, I do not like Angular. And that is not a popular opinion. People think Angular is this beautiful uh, language which is a good competitor to React. I think Angular is utter garbage and should not exist anymore and should die the same way most of the frameworks in Google that don't work anymore did, like Polymer. I think it's time for Google to kill Angular. And my arguments are not surface level. I will be mostly discussing about very serious pain points I have as a developer who has worked both in Angular, React, Vue, and a few others, right? So what we will not be discussing is dumb things like how Angular is better for bigger organizations. That is a really bad argument, or any other argument you see online, because I have not seen a really strong meticulated discussion on why this may not be a good idea, right? There is always dumb discussions like, oh, Angular works at scale. Angular works for big companies. No, React works at scale. React works for good company, big companies. Why do you think Facebook is using React over Angular, right? So we're going to start off with Excalibur because I really like Theo. And we're going to discuss the first point. Angular loves oops, but oops is just bad as an idea, right? And I get where oops comes from, right? I will not be doing I will not be doing the disservice to a great video which I'll be attaching in the description of a very long discussion on why oops is a very bad idea. But I do want to get this video going and want to make it isolated. So I'm gonna rephrase some of the points that were there in this video, right? So I get why OOBS is such an alluring concept, right? Um, when an organization grows, you have complex systems, and you would somehow want to abstract it. Like, for example, if I were to explain how the human body works, for that matter, it would be a really dumb idea if I went and started all the way from quantum mechanics and then went all the way to how each of the interactions work. A more better way would be starting off with something like the head and then drilling down and talking out about how the head contains the brain and then drilling down and talk about the different regions of the brain, which all maybe intercommunicate, right? This is really how we categorize things. This is how we categorize animals, um, and this is how we categorize species and a lot of other things. But it's not a great idea when we are trying to write code. And I'm going to try to explain why. Okay, and just to be very clear, unlike this is not a highly produced uh, 2 minutes video from Fireship.io, and my opinions come from working on these systems on huge scale, uh, huge, huge code bases, and not by I developed 10 applications in backend framework so you don't have to, which was stretched up in 5 minutes, right? So these are some real life examples I'm trying to explain as we move towards trying to understand why I hate object oriented programming concepts in general. So without getting into too much detail, okay, why we want objects. Okay, so not because of inheritance, not because of inheritance or any of the other reasons people usually mention. Polymorphism, for that matter, no, we don't really care about those. And a more detailed discussion about this is more relevant in the video that I'll be linking below than mine, because I don't think I'm qualified enough to answer it well, right? But why we use object oriented programming is because we would like to isolate state, and we would like some kind of abstraction, right? So we really want to isolate state, and we would really like some abstractions, right? So what do I mean by this, right? So let's take a normal application, right? So in a normal application, you have a variety of states of the system. Some of them might be shared among functionalities and stuff, but at the end, you're just talking about states, right? There are like these multitude of states that would interact with each other. And the allure of object-oriented programming is, right, we divide these states and tie them down to types and methods. This seems like a good idea. Okay, so this is what object-oriented programming is trying to do. So it has these public interfaces, and then you would like to communicate. And this way, what you are achieving essentially is saying, oh, I'm not having a shared state, right? And I'm communicating between these two objects, and they have their own private states, and it's all daisy and amazing and cool. It's not. It is not. I'll tell you why. So, you might have seen a common example of the cat being a type of animal and whatnot, and simple abstractions like that. But how a real life application looks, and I am not exaggerating here, is way more complicated with an object structure which you wouldn't like, okay, because systems are not as simple as you would like them to be. So you might be working on the system, right? And you might have an object that basically interacts with two other objects, right? And maybe this object interacts with this, and this with this with this. Now, even though, and maybe there is a isolated cluster of objects here, and you have something like this going on, right? This is a very realistic model of how your code would look in an object-oriented code base that is not two lines, right? And sorry about the ziggly lines. Okay. So the problem with this is because this object cannot really communicate with this object without having a reference of it, a private reference, right? Because if I have object A, I cannot communicate with object B just by throwing messages into the ether. I will have to have a reference of object B, right? So that's object A, this is object A, right? Oh, good Lord. So this is this is object A, this is B, and this is C. So now I have a reference of both B and C in A so as to call the public interfaces of B and C. Yes, you do ensure some checks. So, for example, I could make sure that the public interfaces of B do not let me maybe delete or alter the state however I want. And I can only change the state maybe by adding one. But what you're not understanding here is because each state can just randomly communicate with any other, each object can randomly communicate with each other. You have just made a distributed shared state. This is your state, not the object, right? And to make this less theoretical and a little more simpler, just think about this. What if your eyes could directly communicate with your hand without the brain involved? And then your hand could directly communicate with your ears or um, maybe your skin. It would be problematic. I mean, even in an organization, right? If there was no chain of hierarchy and people were just randomly commanding people to do whatever they want, that is basically anarchy, right? And that's what object-oriented programming gives you, complete anarchy. And I know the purists out there, you object-oriented purists, my friends, would argue that there's a way to solve this, right? You make a system where there is an object at the top, and then you make sure that the data flows in a very organized fashion, Okay, and we can create such structures. I'm not saying it's not possible, right? Okay, this makes sense. But people don't do this. You know why? This is a God anti-pattern. This is a God object anti-pattern. You would not want to do this. And if you think about systems in real life, which use something very similar to object-oriented programming, this is how they work. This is your brain. This is your eyes. And this is things underneath the pupils and few other systems. This may be your spinal cord, and this is spinal cord controls other subsystems that are included in them, and their communication is very much in this flow. This is not how software is. Sometimes your payment module has to communicate with your cart and also few other things. Now, what happens is you have made this beautiful structure for your system, this object oriented genius structure, which you think is the best thing in the world because you're still not experienced enough. And now, after a few weeks of development, you realize that this system in your software needs to communicate with that system. So, because you don't want to make a cluttered state which is unpredictable, you think, okay, I'm going to take the better route and I'm going to do this. I'm going to communicate here, I'm going to communicate down, then I'm going to communicate down. How in God's way is this a good idea? Right? This is really dumb. I do not understand why people love object-oriented programming. People don't do this because you are a developer with limited time and a limited life. So you just get a reference of this object and start using this object. So you are not isolating state and you are not getting the encapsulation that you so desired. So why use object-oriented programming? This is a very small brief of the video of why object-oriented programming is a bad idea in general. But Angular just does this, and I do not like it. So thing with Angular is Angular does something very similar. Angular isolates its components in the form of modules, which have a similar kind of structure. Each module manages what it thinks is the right flow, and then you have these components, which are lower level items that manage things that they need. The problem is when suddenly your student module wants to communicate with your cart module and it does not want to go through your app module to do so. And this creates a lot of problems. So, if you can understand why object oriented programming was a bad idea, I think you can understand why Angular thinking in the same way may not be the best idea in the world. So, yeah, that is the first problem. Object oriented programming is not a good idea, and Angular seems to use it. So that's what I'm trying to say. Like, you think about any real life scenarios where such a system would be implemented. Just think about you being the CEO of a company and just people randomly communicating down the chain. Some group of your developers think that your product should be crypto based, and someone else thinks it should be something else, and then they are communicating between each other and they're causing a big mayhem. And that's what most programs that I have seen that use object oriented programming look like. That's what I've seen very big code bases that use Angular look like. It's extremely unorganized and it is not reusable. There is no modularity achieved, and modules just don't work. And I think Angular team knows this. In the latest version of Angular, they have forgotten modules, right? So if you look at Angular, look at standalone components. This is exactly what I'm talking about. They have ditched the idea of modules because the idea of modules was a bad idea because it was an object oriented idea. So, so I think we have come to a point where we agree that object-oriented programming may not be the best idea in the world, and Angular thought it was and continued using it for a very long time. Now, here is my second argument when it comes to using Angular. So, this is a very typical Angular app you will see with imports, declaration, and bootstrap and providers. So, my second argument is let's go to my second argument. My second argument is ah, Angular is made for backend developers. Angular as a framework is not designed to make the life of a front-end developer easier. It is made so that backend developers can develop a front end easily. And this is true. If you look at what a backend developer does, he usually uses services and he does things like dependency injection and inversion of control. And all of these ideas are again bandage fixes for the problems of OOBs in general. And Angular implements them. Angular just takes them straight out and implements them. It's not a good idea. So DI, an inversion of control, is not bad, but you just don't need them in front end. Front end does not work on these principles. When you need to call an API, you call an API, right? React query is a really good implementation of how API should be managed, not dependency injection using services. I do not know why anyone ever thought this was a good idea. That's what I'm trying to say. This was a time when people wanted to get applications developed, hypothetically Google, when they acquired Angular. They wanted to get it developed quickly. And yeah, they don't want to hire front-end developers, so they made Angular. This is my assumption. Like, but whenever you look at Angular, there all of the terminology is used, all of the things that you see there, along with lifecycle and other things, is very close to how you would see it in a backend framework, not a front-end framework. Primary goal was to make backend developers' life easy, not the other way around, right? So that's my second point to the argument. It's not meant to be used by front-end developers. And to add to that argument, Angular does TI wrong. Okay, what do I mean by this, right? And I hope people don't kill me in the comments for this. So, what I mean by when I say Angular does DI wrong, okay? So let's go and look at the OG dependency injection frameworks like Spring. So, if you look at Spring, um, so if you look at Spring as an language, you will see that Spring Boot has gotten on a lot of recent attraction. Like Spring Boot is a really good addition to Spring itself, and there is auto configuration or auto wiring. If I go to an auto wiring example, let me just go to one so that I can show you. So yeah, guide to using auto wire, right? So let's see. This is dependency injection the way you see it on the app. You just say Spring Boot application. It goes and checks all of the files, and then you create a component that you want to use, which is your dependency that has to be injected, and then you type AutoWire. That's it. That's all you need to know. You don't need to do all of the old XML configurations. You don't need to do complicated things. There is what you wanted as a component. You say, okay, this is the component I really would like to use, and I would like you to AutoWire it for me, right? Even for setters, even for constructors. Like this is This is basically you injecting the service here. There is no other configuration required. Guess how Angular does it? Okay, so if you look at Angular, and I do have a piece of code I want to show you. Angular, you have to do all of these configurations manually. I do not understand, for the love of God, why we can't have auto configuration for services in Angular. Okay, so follow me here. App module has both of these components which are used in app module. And if you go to both of these components, you will see a reference for the service, right? But not only will you have to literally give the path of the code that is going to execute here, you have to mention it on an app module level. When you have a very complex app, it is extremely difficult to know for a fact if you have configured all of your providers right. And it is even more hard when all of it is dynamic and shared everywhere. Why, in God's name, can't Angular have an auto wire? How difficult it is to implement this shit is beyond me. And as I mentioned, their new implementation of standalone component solves this problem. They know this is a problem. So again, I do not understand why are you using this framework, right? You do not need to do this. All you need to do is have an abstraction like use network or React query and run your bloody queries. You do not need to have a service layer and all of these weird abstractions to understand a bloody API call. It is not rocket science. Let's not make it rocket science, right? So, as I mentioned, why can't Angular do this? Auto, I don't know, and I never will. So, yeah, that would be so cool. If I was able to just write at the rate service at any service and write at the rate AutoWire, it would be so much easier, right? Because the reference exists here, Angular. Google, why can't you fix this for me, right? Now, my final argument for why I hate or think Angular is a bad idea is I don't think RxJS is a good idea. So, Angular has a problem that it's a framework. It adopts and is opinionated about building things in a particular way. And one of the choices it took early in its journey is having a deep integration with RxJS. That also adds to the component of NGRX. Reactive state management is not a good idea. What you want in a front-end framework for state management is to ensure that state consistently changes, okay? And state usually, if you think about it, right, when you click a button should fire an event and should change the state of the application. It does not work as data streams. To forcefully make a square round or a circle a square by forcing people to think in a way of streams when web APIs are not streams does not seem like a good idea. So RxJS is not the best idea when it comes to state management. So, and Angular prescribes it. Angular is very obsessed with it. And this again comes from the same perspective of a backend developer. Backend developers are familiar with streams and may even prefer streams and might even require them. Just don't understand this whole point of streams as being this in front end just does not make sense. With that, I would like to close the argument of why you shouldn't be using Angular. I mean, do mention in the comments if you feel any of my points are absurdly stupid, and do share it with your manager. If your manager thinks that you should continue using Angular, I think you shouldn't. I think you're wasting a lot of valuable developer time by continuing to use a framework which was not developed for front end. So maybe move to React. React is doing something well. Next.js conference just came out, and by definition now, considering that Angular is still stuck with Webpack, React is 1,000 times better in build times. And Angular was already slow when it came to build times. I don't think we should keep using Angular anymore. And I really would like to have a more deeper discussion with the community than the surface level nonsense that I see online. That's why I made this video. Hopefully you can, hopefully you have a good day. And that's all. Bye bye.